I'm your host, Erik Davis, continuing the conversations about the cultures of consciousness. As a San Franciscan now for over 25 years, I've been privy to the experience of watching the technology industry, Silicon Valley, computer culture, techno culture, explode and sort of collapse and then explode at an even greater velocity, all the while changing the city, changing people's consciousness, changing the very fabric of everyday life. And I came out here partly drawn to this culture because I was already interested and kind of slipped my way into the countercultural fringe of cyberculture or technoculture back in the early 1990s. I came out to San Francisco in 1990 for an event called the Cyberthon, a now obscure relic of some past many years ago, but it was a crisscross of the Whole Earth Catalog, hippie Stewart Brand, proto-maker culture with virtual reality and psychedelic superstars like Timothy Leary, science fiction writers, William Gibson, Bruce Sterling, Are You Serious, Mondo 2000. I met a lot of good people there that ended up being my friends over the time. So I was in a very interesting place to watch as various countercultural impulses express themselves in the growing technology industry, and of course eventually becoming a rather minor theme in that great story. Although, as our guest today will show us, that the imprints of the counterculture on technology, on Silicon Valley, are not sort of just a minor froth, that really you can't tell the story of the modern computer, of the internet, of Wired magazine, of Google, et cetera, without talking about the possibilities, the potentials, the dreams, the utopias, the craziness, the excesses, maybe even the idiocy sometimes of the counterculture. And our guest today is Adam Fisher, who was my editor at Wired magazine when I wrote regularly for the magazine about 25 years ago, and just sort of at the point in the magazine's history where they were trying to like chase out any last countercultural remnants so that it could just become a nice Silicon Valley, the New Yorker for the Silicon Valley or whatever. That's not the right analogy. But I got to do some great stories with Adam, and I've been following his writing as a cultural journalist, a technology journalist, since that time. And his new book, his first book, is called Valley of Genius: The Uncensored History of Silicon Valley as Told by the Hackers, Founders, and Freaks Who Made It Boom. And it's a wonderful book. It's a story that needs to be told, and it needs to be told in detail, because the Silicon Valley is so driven by hype that the stories that both it tells itself about itself and the stories that other people tell about Silicon Valley have, I think, an extra layer of hype and simplicity and bullshit in them. And one of the wonderful things about this book is that Adam elected to write it by interviewing over 200 people, some of them quite extensively, and then sitting down with scissors and huge stacks of printed out paper and cutting and splicing a story that's told in the voices of the interviewees. So you see their names, you get a sentence, a two-sentence, sometimes a paragraph, usually not for very long, and then it's woven together in this very rich way. And it's a marvelous way to tell a story, because you just get more points of view than any single person, who's always going to have their spin, their agenda, has. And I've spent the last couple of days reading through the book and reading stories both that I know pretty well and things that I don't know anything about at all. and I've learned a great deal and enjoyed the ride. So I think it's a crucial story, and again, particularly now as we're sort of reassessing the value of Silicon Valley, the meaning of these technology companies that now so dominate our lives. It's really important to have a nitty gritty sense of the history. So I'd like to welcome Adam onto the show. Thanks for joining us on Expanding Mind.
Thank you, Eric. Great to be here.
Yeah, and congrats on this, man. It's clearly a tremendous labor. I mean, just the amount of work you had to do to put this together, and I can only imagine the the insane amount of cutting and pasting and reorganizing that had to happen as you wove these stories together. But really, once I now have had time to read it, it's like I can't imagine it being told in any other way. I mean, it's perfect for the story.
Yeah, I mean, just it's not just the cutting and the pacing, but the wrangling of the billionaires, like getting their attention and getting them to talk to you, very difficult. I'll just tell you that. Um, but most people recognize the value of doing a story this way and doing a real unvarnished, de-bullshitted history. And I think that's what we got here. Even though it's the hard way to write a book, because you can't just write a transition, you have to get someone to tell you who was witnessed what happened to kind of move the story along. It's the best way, because I found so much new stuff about a story I thought I knew frontwards and backwards, and that's because I went back to primary sources.
Yeah, and that's what I said. Even reading things that I knew pretty well, or always details, and not even just details, but just the complexity of it. And that's one of the things that um, I guess I'd have a question for you is what since even with all of these you have all of these stories, you're still like condensing, you're crystallizing a story, you're picking out the things you think are interesting, you're picking out things you think are important, you're still selecting this mass of interviews with certain, I don't want to use the word say agenda, but certain perspectives that you're interested in. And what were those perspectives? Were there things that you came in already knowing these are things I want to say about Silicon Valley, or did the stories really emerge from the conversations you had, or was it some combination of those two?
It was some combination of the two. The book is divided into three parts. It's kind of the birth of the personal computer revolution, so that's 68 to 84. And I knew that was the combined story of Xerox, Atari, and Apple. So Xerox PARC being the great foundational R&D department whence everything kind of came from. They were out in Palo Alto. Palo Alto Research Center was what PARC stood for. So and then I knew that I wanted to do the kind of post 95 story. So kind of 95 was the Netscape IPO. So that's the opening of kind of the consumer internet all the way to the iPhone. And then it gets pretty clear what you want to do. You obviously have to do Google, the iPhone and iPod story with Apple, Facebook, and I thought eBay and Napster were similarly obvious. But it was really this weird interregnum, the kind of second of three sections of 84 and 95 that I really just emerged through my reporting. And the theme that emerged is kind of this birth of a cyberculture theme. And so I mean, and look, Eric, I don't have to tell you about this. If you didn't coin the word cyberculture, I would be surprised. Um, but,
No,
but
I can make no such claims, but it really was quite entertaining to read. This sort of parallel world. I mean, I didn't move out here till '95, so I missed some of the high and holy days at the Mondo 2000 house and the very beginnings of Wired. But I knew a lot of the characters, and it was really that was another wonderful thing about the way you tell the story is that certain people that I got to know well because they were unusually friendly and interested in me or whatever, but who aren't necessarily like the major players, aren't necessarily the people you hear that much about. You know, they're the kind of supporting characters in a, you know, a business story about Steve Jobs, or, you know, some other kind of book that's really focusing on the major players. But a lot of those characters actually show up a lot, like people like Brian Bellendorf, who's like instrumental both in cyberculture in the sense that he was working at Wired. He started the SF Raves list. He was very utopian, very much a, you know, a kind of Richard Stallman approach to software. And of course, he was part of the Apache team that were always trying to make a kind of open source internet, you know, tool kit available. So fascinating guy and a super sweetheart. But he's, you know, he's not like super, you know, loud personality. He's not a really arrogant guy. He's a sweetheart. And like would not think that he would get kind of his due, and he shows up here a lot. And there's other people like this, well, Dan Cockey and other characters. But reading that period in particular, the 84 to 95, it's no longer really clear. It doesn't read like a business story. You know, it doesn't read like, well, what we're really talking about here is the emergence of this massive, you know, sector of the global economy. It's like there's something else going on that's not quite in the university. It's not quite in the research labs. It's not quite in the entrepreneurs. It's not quite in the drug culture. There really is this kind of confusing slipstream where it's not altogether clear where the line between fun and work and science and consciousness, you know, are going on. I mean, it was really a striking a period of time.
Yeah, I mean, and because everybody looks at Silicon Valley, sees these billions and billionaires being created, they think it's a business story. But I think it's just the business story is just a smaller part of a larger cultural story about a new culture, a new pop culture, a new youth culture. And, you know, from 84, which was when the Mac launched, and 95, which is when Netscape essentially launched, was kind of dark years for business reporters in Silicon Valley. Why? Because Microsoft was totally dominant. And Microsoft, let's remind our listeners, is not a Silicon Valley company. It's a tech company, but they are based up in outside of Seattle. But if you start looking at the cultural story, that period, that fallow period where not many people are making that much money, is kind of where the culture that we now know, you know, meme culture, all the rest, both the good parts and frankly the bad parts, was being created. So they were not only figuring out how to, you know, kind of you know, build new things and make and create, you know, put the kind of creative DNA into business teams, but they're also figuring out what it all meant. Um, you know, the first hackers conference was in 84, 85, and that's when the phrase information wants to be free was spoken for the first time. It, directly after that, the well was established, which
Well,
is
let's just stop and talk
yeah.
about the well a bit, because that was something, you know, again, one of the interesting things about history in general is if you do your homework, you start to realize that things that look new aren't quite as new, or that there are these moments in the past that anticipate a lot of what we're doing. And the well is a great example of something that was never commercial. They weren't even able to scale particularly well, even though they had a lot of users in the 1980s. It was like basically a bulletin board, but it became kind of the first, you know, a social media space, a space of dialogue and discussion, and you know, online personalities, and frankly flame wars and trolling. And one of the stories you tell there is how some of the, you know, the leaders, particularly Stuart Brand, just got sick of the whole thing because it was the politics and the way in which you get a lot of smart, nerdy people on a bulletin board, and they get mean. And especially if you give them anonymity, you get mean. There's that one great story about the having the anonymous conference, and they were all like, oh my God, we cannot give anonymity. Things just get completely out of control. And reading that now, even if we saw what the well looked like now, you'd be like, what? Just a bunch of what? This is nothing. And yet you can sort of, it's like this prophetic moment where all of these social features that we now see all over the place are done is in a kind of petri dish.
Yeah, the Stuart Brand quote was, the anonymous conference was easy to set up, and it lasted less than a week because people immediately behaved absolutely viciously to each other. They pretended to be each other. They thought they were just spoofing, but actually it was mortally insulting stuff they were doing. And these aren't like kids that have discovered the well. He's talking about like the intellectuals and kind of that populated the well. Even they kind of resorted to trolling and flame wars when given the opportunity to hide behind that. It and that was kind of the great lesson that they took away. It's like you cannot do an anonymous, and you can't even do an unmoderated social network, or else you get this kind of amplification of the most negative sides of human personality. And yes, this stuff was brand new. They literally discovered it. The word flame, as in I've been flamed online, was first used in that context on the well.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff like that. And then another obvious example from that same arc of time in the middle section in the book, which I also thought was the most interesting, partly because it was both more familiar, and also like I learned even more about certain things because it had less of an obvious structure. And you have a chapter devoted to virtual reality. And again, I remember some of those characters, Scott Fisher from NASA, and Jaron Lanier with the dreads, and I got to try out the VPL glove and all that kind of stuff. But you have an interesting sort of take on that on VR, because it was this great question of like, there was so much enthusiasm. There was so much media attention, both from the mainstream media and from the Mondo 2000 crazies who were like, this is like drugs. And, everybody wanted it, and there was fantasies about teledildonics. You could actually have a whole magazine about like cybersexuality, even though it didn't really exist. I mean, in retrospect, it's this very strange thing where a technology is in its, infancy. This huge amount, not just of hype, but of just projection and desire and fantasy, surrounds it, and then it doesn't go anywhere. And now it's actually happening. It's actually being, coming on online. It's going to be part of our immediate future more and more. And it's such a long gap, and it's such a strange kind of foreshock, if you will. So talk about that chapter. I'm just interested in how you decided to tell that story of all this enthusiasm leading to next to nothing.
Well, I knew I wanted to write about Jaron Lanier and Jaron Lanier's company VPL, because he's just one of these kind of insider figures that I think is terribly important. He literally invented virtual reality in the same way that, say, Nolan Bushnell invented video games, and we're talking, these people invented cultural forms that I think will be remembered, like we now remember jazz, or really the movies, the Hollywood movie, the two other kind of big modern American art forms. Anyway, but yeah, when I got into it, it was this question of why did it first there was all this, Timothy Leary and Jaron Lanier in that period were kind of like best friends. Um, or at least, the mutual admiration society between them was like kind of at its peak. Um, and there were all these crazy stories, but yeah, this is a tech history. Why did it fail? And it all kind of came down to the web coming along and the kind of the everybody was expecting virtual reality to be the next big thing, and all of a sudden it's actually the internet. And David Levitt, who was kind of the other guy with dreadlocks in VPL, had a great quote about that. He said, um, before VPL ended, I used to think that there was a technological inevitability to VR, that it was unstoppable. But after the company was gone, I realized that it takes a visionary, a Steve Jobs or a Jaron Lanier or a Douglas Engelbart, determines whether these things are overlooked or not. A true visionary just makes the future about what is available and does not wait for the technology to catch up with him. And really, that's the whole book in miniature. Um, this is a history, but Silicon Valley is an interesting place to do a history because they look at history different than you or me or almost anybody else. It's not something that happens to us. It's something that they do. And that's the real power of the Silicon Valley culture to to make, because it's comprised of makers and doers and that let's just make something happen kind of makes mindset, that we can build it mindset. I mean, when this is the last time we saw that? Maybe World War II.
Well, it's funny how much that one of the things that people say in your book for a number of ways is that in a way what is the greatest innovation of Silicon Valley is the kind of startup culture, or sort of the logic of development, and the ability of people to leave large companies and go start small companies, the ability to get venture capital that no one's going to beat the crap out of you if you actually just burn through with a failure, because they recognize that there's sort of a larger logic of it. And when you look at that whole culture, and you go, how did that come from? Where did all that come from? A lot of it has to do with World War II, because when we came out of World War II, guys in the military, guys in the university, people in Washington, people in business were like, wow, we invented a hell of a lot of stuff in a short period of time under a tremendous amount of pressure. How can we artificially create those circumstances in peacetime so that we can continue this innovation boom? And one of the places that they try to do that is, of course, in Silicon Valley with Stanford and, da-da-da-da. And so some of that stuff really comes out of a way of trying to match the innovation of World War II.
Yeah.
Which is a fascinating thing. But I wanted to point to one of the most interesting parts in the book for me, in terms of, yes, there's a story about making and doing, but there's also, of course, the problems that certain things end up winning for other kinds of reasons, and great possibilities that many intelligent people were very invested in, thought seriously about, were left on the cutting room floor. And one of those is, requires a little bit of work, but I think is worth talking about, is the chapter Fumbling the Future. And I'll just set it up, and then maybe you can kind of go into the details. So the basic story, which is the one that I'm familiar with, other people who've read histories of this stuff were familiar with, histories of Apple, is so there's Xerox PARC, where all of this tremendous innovation is going on, running on some of Engelbart's ideas, but taking them farther. You got Ethernet, you've got a laser printer, you've got a graphic user interface, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of the elements, a lot of the core language of our personal computing comes from Xerox PARC. So they're doing all this innovation, but their corporate overlords don't really know what to do with it. Xerox is being goofy, they're being stupid or whatever, conservative. They don't like the idea of a computer. So then a young Steve Jobs wanders through. He looks at some stuff. He goes, "Ooh, cool," and then he, scampers off and ports a lot of the ideas into the Apple II, into the idea, the sort of logic of Apple computers. But what the point is that happens in Fumbling the Future, the argument is that while he took some superficially very significant things from what was happening at Xerox PARC, he left the really complicated and really powerful stuff behind, partly because he knew that at a certain point, if you really want to have a consumer personal computer, it can't be that complicated. So you can't expect people to learn that much about the machines they're using and therefore be able to really use them in the ways in which they were designed to be used. That seemed to me an extremely significant transfer point from a certain hacker culture that was intellectually rigorous, very utopian, human potential movement influence, like we can really make people smarter with complicated tools that they're going to really, and then at some point there's this kind of shift to simplicity that makes everything happen, but we also really lose something in that.
So, Eric, that was a really good synopsis of a chapter called Fumbling the Future. And yeah, Fumbling the Future is the name of a history of Xerox PARC, where the argument was made that Xerox invented everything and totally blew it because they commercialized nothing but the laser printer. Because they weren't a computer company, they're a paper company, and they like paper. By the way, the reason we have like a desktop metaphor based on paper is because of just that reason, even today. However, but this what I learned when I went back to the sources is that actually um, it's a little bit different. People think, the real insiders think that it was Jobs that fumbled the future because he kind of stole the wrong stuff. He stole the superficial kind of idea of a mouse and a graphical user interface where you could, kind of drag and drop. But he didn't steal kind of the deep structure where everything could be modified by the user, and really he gave something to the public that was just kind of a very shallow imitation. And really everyone from Alan Kay, the guy who invented everything, or at least the graphical user interface at PARC, to Woz, Steve, the co-founder of Apple, essentially agrees that that is true. But there is another very similar moment with Apple, 15, 20 years later. And that's when the iPod came out. So Steve Jobs returned to Apple because as kind of a last-ditch Hail Mary, the board said, we're going to run out of money in 90 days. Let's just tell Steve that he can run the company again. And he stopped the flow of red ink and then started rolling out new products. And the first real new product breakthrough product that he rolled out was the iPod. And the iPod led literally directly to the iPhone. And a lot of the insiders that the real kind of people who built the core technology and the core ideas identify that moment too is where everything went wrong. That's where we go from Apple goes from building what they used to call the bicycle for the mind, something that would augment and extend human capability, uh, to inventing, another entertainment device, an opiate for the masses. And really, that's where we are today, right?
Yeah.
We have, Apple has nothing to do with, well, it's a little bit to do with Twitter and Facebook, but we're at a place where people are disgusted by Silicon Valley, I think rightly so, because what they've created is not this incredible suite of tools. And let's remember where that came from. That was Stuart Brand's core idea, right? But they've created this, new kind of this kind of machine that spews out kind of ideological echo chambers and hate and fake news, and you can just find the worst of human behavior just on full display right up on the front page of your internet, unless you're really vigorous about editing and curating what you see.
Yeah, I mean that's one of the things about this story that um, I reading your book, even though you don't take, and I'm actually kind of curious in the I just finished the conclusion before we started, and you don't take the opportunity at that point to really go into some of the critical problems with the very culture that you're describing. Those elements are in the book. They're woven in um, through individual voices, but we are at a very interesting point of kind of reckoning with the story. But one of the reasons that I think your book is so important is because it gives more complexity to the Silicon Valley side of things, because people have terribly simplistic ideas of it, and I encounter this a lot talking to technology critics, talking to people who are who hate the California ideology, they call it, the sort of marriage of markets and hippie anarchism and all this kind of thing. And your story just shows there's a lot more complexities to it, but it is in some ways a tragic story, or a story of capitalism as usual, even though it leads to what some might say is a different kind of capitalism. And part of what I mean by that is that you begin your story with Doug Engelbart. We've mentioned his name a few times, famous for inventing the first mouse, and quite a visionary. And he was overwhelmingly motivated, this is the 60s, by a dream of human augmentation. This is the time when Essalin's beginning, the idea of human potential. All these things people hate now. They think that it just means the selfish, consumerist, neoliberal ego. And it's so much more than that, or it was so much more than that. And it's really important to acknowledge what has been lost in this transition, rather than saying, oh, look, from the beginning, all of this stuff was just leading towards clickbait. All of this stuff was just leading towards, essentially propagandistic mind control. And there's a lot of technology critics who will say that. They'll blame the counterculture. They'll blame technological nerds. They'll blame Stanford. They'll blame the whole thing for some of these transformations that have occurred. And yes, they've happened for reasons that are internal to Silicon Valley. Absolutely. Many of the characters in your book made a huge amount of money doing things that, in the long run didn't work out that well for everybody. But at the same time, the positive side of the story, part of which is about this human augmentation. How do we make humans better? How do we let people do the things they already want to do better? And not just get them locked into different forms of kind of consumerism or media, or different forms of, surveillance and work control, all the kinds of negative things that we can talk about. What for you are the strongest values or ideas, philosophies, motivations that you believe are inherent to this culture that you have chronicled, that we could really use a lot more of now, that could be brought forward, that could be used to help navigate us through this period where the dark side of this whole technological event is so obvious to us.
Well, before I answer that question, let me just say, this larger question of, what have we wrought here, is perhaps that is my next book. It was just a little beyond the scope, but which is why I didn't challenge it. In the end. Um, However, I will say that every person, to a man, to a woman, that I interviewed brought up this issue pretty much independently to me and wanted to talk about it. And I used most of their quotes when they criticized the Valley. Um, and the and it all boils down, and they all basically said the exact same thing. It all went wrong when the tidal wave of money came in. And with the money came the profiteers and the carpetbaggers and the people looking to get rich quick. Okay. And so what I see um, is really two cultures, uh, like a um, like a deserving, wonderful, creative, almost kind of Silicon Valley um, culture of makers, um, and then a kind of evil, or at least a moral money culture that is threatening to overwhelm it. And I think, and I knew that that dichotomy was there, and I really, that's why I didn't actually interview any venture capitalists, because they are peripheral to the real act of creation, which is the spark, the really thing that's worth saving in Silicon Valley. And then to answer your question directly, uh, you know, what is it? What is it about Silicon Valley that's worth celebrating? It's it's you know Steve Jobs said it best, actually, when he did his commencement speech at Stanford, and he talked about this kind of realization that the world was everything in the world that you can see was actually made by people who were, you know, just people, and who weren't smarter than you. And so you don't have to just accept it if you don't like the world. You can change it. And so I think that is the core thing that that is worth celebrating, preserving. And I would argue strenuously uh, to you know the California ideology people, or any of these kind of so-called critics who just don't know the history, that that is, that there is a there is a real Silicon Valley, and then there's a fake Silicon Valley. There was a time when people said, "Oh, I want to change the world," and it was sincere. And then now we're in a time when you hear those words, and you wonder who who uh, who bought what crummy PR agency is like charging for that kind of advice. Um, so you know, I feel very strongly that it's also a moral choice to be optimistic about the future, and that it's kind of a responsibility um, for to kind of believe in the ability of the future to be better, and help the future to be better, and find what's good in what the kids are doing.
Yeah, yeah, that totally makes sense for me. It's funny when I have these conversations, when I engage people around the future, I'm often more positive than I am in my own mind. It's a real interesting thing, and I go, why? Sometimes I think about that. I go, why is that? How come when I'm sitting on my own reading news or whatever, and I get these kind of despairing thoughts, and then when I'm in conversation, even if it turns to the dark, there's a kind of a hope, there's sort of there's an enthusiasm, there's a hope, there's a sense of possibility, and I realize that it is partly an ethical choice that comes up for me in the context of communicating, that if I'm dealing with other people, if I'm engaging other people directly, if we're talking about things, that there's sort of like an inherent little hope guy that comes up who goes, hey, come on, look at it, you can look at it from different angles.
There's also a cognitive bias at work. I mean, the joke is that if the technology existed, when you're a teenager, it has always existed. And then if it like emerges in your 20s and 30s, it's the most amazing thing ever invented, and it's going to, quote, change the world, change everything. And then if there's a technology comes along in your 40s or 50s, like it is an abomination that needs, to be outlawed. And you can actually see, you can kind of predict the ages of people by where they kind of make this line where everything went south. So, you know, that said, um, you know, when we're talking about the horrors of Silicon Valley, I like to say, well, like what Silicon Valley? One of my favorite quotes was this guy, Steve Perlman, who's one of these figures that everybody in the Valley recognizes, but no one's ever heard of before who's not in the Valley. Anyway, he was everywhere. He was the intern at Atari. He was at the R&D lab at Apple, et cetera, et cetera. He's at General Magic, the first kind of cell phone company or hardware company. Anyway, he said, look, Adam, Silicon Valley is Detroit, in the 50s. Okay. It's dominated by three companies, Ford, Chrysler, and GM, and, there'll be a new tail fin or a new way to make it convertible, but nothing is really going to change. It's locked down. And I agree. Apple, Google, and Facebook are these monopolies essentially, or quasi monopolies that pretty much control everything. And if you're but you gotta but if you want to see the hope and you want to see the future, you got to look under that for the underground underfunded kind of ideas that the young technologists who are still flooding here from all over the world are excited about. And so, and when you do, you these you got these interesting blockchain technologies which really could throw those giants. You've got all kinds of hardware startups that are going to totally change transportation, among other things. Um, you've got the quantum computing folks that they're that are trying to which could again change everything in the way that the integrated circuit set off this last 50 years of hyper change and hyper growth. I mean, I really think that we haven't seen anything yet. And these arguments over the shape of our media are just going to look trivial in another 50 years' time, because we're talking about the shape of, life itself. I mean,
Yeah. Well, I mean, it does seem to be that.
the geneticists that are coming here, and turning genetics into an information science. Those are big breakthroughs that are coming. I think it'll make this look relatively small.
Yeah, that's a funny way of thinking about it, but it makes sense, and that's some of the things your folks talk about in the last chapter, where you're kind of looking forward towards other kinds of developments. Too much for now. I
Too much.
wanted to mop up with a couple of questions. One is like one of the great characters in Silicon Valley lore is Nolan Bushnell, Mr. Atari. You know, the Atari's an amazing company. They were so weird. They were so like seat of the pants. It was such a crazy boom and bust. It was such a '70s story. And you got to meet the guy, right? So how much was he at this point? Was he kind of a puppy dog? I mean, he has this rep as like he's like the archetype of the Silicon Valley big man, you know, a real character. So what was he like?
Yeah, Michael Malone, who was the first Silicon Valley reporter ever, said Nolan, he's the first T-shirt tycoon. He's the first modern Silicon Valley entrepreneur. He's not building heavy-duty hardware. He's not doing silicon. He's doing consumer electronics. Literally, every kind of swaggering young CEO that from literally from Steve Jobs up till now is consciously, in Jobs' case, or unconsciously aping what Nolan invented, like the whole like, you know, look at me, I'm going to change everything now. And it's you know, it's your 20s, I guess, but he is the most delightful, grandfatherly, kind of cool character that I met in this whole thing. He didn't actually make a lot of money from Atari. I mean, he did, but he ended up losing it all on trying to make a robot that would live in your home and fetch you beer. And he's just great. What can I say?
Well, that actually kind of warms me. You know, I
Yeah.
really like that, and I just also like the whole, you know, I mean, I guess because I'm just obsessed with the '70s, but imagining them like putting together Atari machines in an old roller rink. And then, like, you know, Steve Jobs comes back from India and he's shaved and his head's shaved and he's wearing saffron robes. And they're like, he's like, can I get my job back? They're like, sure. You
Yeah,
know?
isn't that great?
So now here's a political question I've had, and I've been thinking a lot about this. And one of the things that irritates me about the leftist critique of Silicon Valley and of California in general, with the California ideology being a good example, is the problem, and it's a real problem, and I don't know how to answer it, and I know this is something you're interested in too, outside of the book, is how to distinguish between two forces that are, to my mind, equally at play in at least the first two and certainly the second of your three stories or the three sections of your book. And that's the tension between what I would call a hippie anarchism, where the idea is that of course, you want to empower the self because the self is a place where creativity and autonomy comes from and allows you to do other things with other people that are super cool. You don't want to be controlled. You don't want the state to be telling you what to do. You don't want you don't want your culture to be telling you what to do. You want to make it up yourself. And that might be naive, that might be whatever, but there's you know, a lot of the hippie ethics, though a lot of the politics were leftist. The politics on the street, the sympathy with decolonialization in the third world, the sympathy with Black Panthers, the resistance to the Vietnam War, that some of those issues also overlapped a more anarchist kind of tendency, which tended to be a little more apolitical, but was also deeply engaged in the possibilities of remaking life by throwing off the burden of tradition, by throwing off people who are telling you what to do. There was a kind of utopian sense that working together, you could create something new. And so that's one side. And then on the other side is what we would call a kind of right-wing or market libertarianism, which, if you look at its rhetoric, actually isn't that different than some of the anarchist positions. And so these leftists, Adam Curtis in his documentaries is a great example of this, but this is a common European critique of the West Coast, is that those were always basically the same thing. that hippies were just libertarians with long hair and weed. And so the whole thing can be written off as a great example of what goes wrong when you have market libertarianism controlling, services and society. Uh, I know you've thought about this, a lot of these things. How would you characterize that relationship in terms of the Silicon Valley story? Where, how important was libertarianism? How hairy was it? Was there a distinction and maybe even a tension between a more kind of hippie anarchism and a more hard-edged market libertarianism with certain companies or certain individuals? How would you characterize that?
I think before the Clinton era and before, or Clinton slash Obama era, and before really 2001, that's kind of when the hammer came down in terms of kind of cultural dissent in this country, as well as the point, in 2004, that was when, just after that was when Google IPO'd and really became a force that the political and power elites on the east coast of this country had to deal with them. And that's when, somewhere in that era, is where this kind of blanket, I'm a social democrat, I'm a capital L liberal kind of, that's when that happened. This idea that, but before that, and especially during that 84-95 period that we were talking about, cyberculture, there was an absolute diversity of fringe political ideas, what we now call fringe. It was the norm to be a little bit radical. And yes, there are pretty much every flavor of libertarianism or anarchism or but they all got along. I don't know why. Uh, and I feel that the libertarian ethos is super strong, and it's still there, just kind of um, um, hidden a little bit behind kind of a wall of political correctness. But I don't think it's the capital L libertarianism, as in the Libertarian Party, which has pretty much sold itself to, um, you know, the, to the highest bidder, and has become not market oriented, not pro market, but pro business, and often pro established business. So
Well, that's a really important distinction right there. Is that
yeah,
there's a very strong stream of both liberal and classic liberal thought and libertarian thought, which is very pro market, but is quite critical of monopoly
yeah,
capitalism, and
yeah.
that's actually one of their main. Whereas once those ideas get translated again into kind of more of a pop media space, and also for people who just hate capitalism in general,
Yeah,
they don't see that distinction as
they
being
don't see the
very
distinction.
important.
Yeah, and I really think it all goes back to a guy who pops up in my first chapter, the guy who may be most responsible for getting LSD into the mouths of hippies, and brains of hippies. The guy who literally was the first to use the phrase personal computer in print, Stuart Brand. Stuart Brand is not a capital L libertarian. In fact, he's probably the founder of the modern ecological movement, okay, as well as all these other things. But if you listen to him and you parse his ideas, and you listen to his protege Kevin Kelly and you parse Kelly's ideas, they're libertarian-ish. They're highly tinged with this idea that, you know, well, why should other people or the state control us? Why can't we do it ourselves? And I think it's both an ideology, but it's an ideology, but it's something else. It's just a recognition of reality. The reality is that people are becoming more and more and more empowered. Um, to do stuff. I mean, now I, as an individual, could send a satellite to space for a couple $1,000s. That was something that, 50 years ago took the greatest nation, most powerful nation on earth, something like 10% of the entire GDP for 10 years to do. You know what I mean? It's like we are entering an empowered age. The scary thing is that these technologies also empower the state, and there's kind of this race between oppression and the oppressive forces. I mean, look at some of the things that are going on in China and the kind of liberatory forces.
When people
Who's
are
going to win that race?
yeah.
Who are we going to trust to win it? And it's really we're going to have to go back to the technologists and hope that they are developing technologies that will keep the individual in front of the state. And, we haven't heard about crypto or the cypherpunks, as they were called, since basically 9/11. But I assure you, they're coming back and working on stuff, and that's what we have to identify as kind of the real Silicon Valley and the good in Silicon Valley, while we as at the same time we condemn like the ways that technology can trap and enslave us.
Well, and also money, as you mentioned earlier, just the way what happens when, the financialization and just the huge, I mean, it's just, it's a whole other topic, but that there are values driving people then and now in Silicon Valley that are not money values, and that those are not, they don't mean that you're just being a shill for the cash that we see, or, the whole financialization that dominates it. So, I think you've done a really good job of pulling out those values, because even if they're not the strongest ones, or the ones that are the best we could possibly imagine, in some ways they're some of the best ones we have in a place that still has the power to make change on a very strange, very massive playing field.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to find the history we need and then celebrate that. I mean, that's my bias.
Great.
And I think this is the history we need. And this is not, didn't write this because I was a history buff. I wrote this because I am interested in the future and where we're going. And, there's a million people who claim they have a crystal ball. Every one of them is a liar. It was Marshall McLuhan who said it. If you want to navigate the future, you have to look into the rearview mirror. And that is this book.
Excellent. Well, we're going to end it right there. That's perfect. Adam, thanks so much for being on Expanding Mind.
Thank you, Eric. It's such a pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah, that was a blast. Adam Fisher, old pal, Valley of Genius, Uncensored History of Silicon Valley. Highly worthwhile. And I'll see you next week. Until then, keep your minds open.